Cool, then let's go ahead and get started. So thank you all who have joined either on Facebook or in the Zoom for our third of the fall seminar series. We've got an exciting presentation today from Maira, Emmy, and then you pronounced your last name. I've always pronounced it Reimao, but you pronounced
Totally
it in a
fine.
way. Okay, let's go with Reimao. Maira, Emmy Reimao, who's in the Food and Resource Economics Department at University of Florida. Previously, so Emmy, should I call you Emmy or Maira?
Yes, you can call me Emmy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Emmy went to UC Davis with Matt Gammons and I. She graduated and then went off to a very fancy postdoc at Yale, and she is now an assistant professor of development economics at University of Florida. She will be presenting some work she's kind of been working on off and on, I understand. And with that, take it away, Emmy.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Alex and Matt, for organizing, actually for your entire department to organizing this and basically keeping these seminars alive and allowing people like our department who don't have seminars right now during the coronavirus to actually just free ride off you guys and enjoy the seminars as well. So you're doing a public service by doing this, to be honest. So thank you so much for that. And of course, thank you for having me and inviting me to do this. So as Alex alluded to, this is actually a paper that I worked on a while ago. Like this was actually a version of this, a very primitive version of this was part of my dissertation. And then I went off to do a postdoc where I didn't work on this at all. I've been working on seasonal migration in Bangladesh instead. And then I've recently decided to pick this up again and, do something with it. So this is an encouragement to everyone who is still in their dissertation or recently finished their dissertation and is totally over their paper. You can still come back to it later and there is still life to it. So this paper specifically, I'm going to be talking about daycare and women's employment. So the effects of that, of access to daycare in the short run, in the long run, and also in the household. So this relates to durable goods. So there are three questions that I'm looking into for this study. So first is, how does access to daycare affect women's employment and earnings during the daycare period, right? So when their children are little, how does having access to daycare affect their employment and their earnings? So this has been answered in several papers, but one paper, there is a paper related to the study that has already done that to some extent. So here I'm just confirming the results and extending the results here. The next question is, well, how about once children are age eligible for school, right? So how about once they are no longer in daycare? Does having had previous access to daycare, so that is having had the a better environment for actually being able to work and maybe gaining more work experience, does that affect women's earnings and employment now in this medium run once your kids are still young, but no longer in daycare? And the answer here is probably not. This is the result I find. And then lastly, the third question is, so are there differences between households that did have access to free daycare program during that daycare period when their children were young and those that didn't, once these children are in elementary school or preschool or kindergarten, like once they are already out of daycare age? So yes, the answer here is yes, there are still differences. You do see some long-lasting differences. And note, just a side note here, that I'm not looking at school performance or child development. This is a paper about women's earnings, employment, and living conditions. The living conditions part may certainly have an effect or be relevant to child development for sure, but I'm not looking at tests and school performance. This project specifically, we did collect that data, so it does exist, and there will be a separate paper on that, but I'm not involved in that paper looking at child development and access to daycare. So essentially, if daycare, it can improve your learning. So these are the three questions that I'm focused on, which really have to do with women's employment, earnings, and living conditions. So the background for this and why do we care? So the idea of there being a child penalty in women's earnings is fairly established, as shown in the literature. It's also raised a lot in policy arguments for why there needs to be a public child care, right? So here, this graph here, or this little picture here, is just the daily charts from The Economist, from a chart from last year that they put out, showing that there's a drop in women's earnings once they have children, right? Like this is the line that shows 0 years, and the women's earnings drops compared to men, and it stays low. It might come back a little bit, but basically there's a permanent penalty for having children, right? So this is raised in policy as an argument for why there needs to be public childcare as a way to like ease the penalty on women. But notice that all of these, and really most of the research on this, pertains to developed countries. So this doesn't really say much about what happens to women in developing countries. Also, this data usually comes from a panel data, but a cross-section of the entire population of the country. So it includes women with very little education, women and men, because we're comparing them, with very little education, and those with much more education. So that would mean people who might have, for whom years of experience might matter a lot for how much they earn, and others for whom it might not. So we're still, even though this literature exists, and even though the need for childcare, you know, like an argument for that as why, like how to address the earnings gap, or an argument for why we should have childcare, even though that is there, it doesn't really say much about developing countries or low-income earners. So one question we don't have answered from all this literature is, well, does childcare decrease this penalty? There is this earnings penalty. Does childcare actually close that earnings penalty? There is definitely some research on that. So here's just another entry point into this, but this one looks at, but here I am looking at the medium run, which the literature is very, very sparse. Also, what about in developing countries? Again, this research really is, like most of the literature on this that's raised as examples for why we do need childcare is from developed countries. And then lastly, what about for low-income households or households that face low wages, right? So what about for women who might have lower levels of education or might just be facing lower wages, for where maybe their experience might not matter. So for example, if you're a hairdresser, it doesn't really matter how many years of experience you have, right? Like you're not going to make a ton, you don't make more year per year of experience. Similarly, if you are a babysitter, you will not make more. Like there is some threshold, like you might bump up for a little while, but then you're not making more for each year that you've worked. Similarly, like, you know, if you are like a petty trader, right? Like you're just not. So the problem with a lot of this research is it really looks at a cross-section of the population. So it could be that a lot of this is driven by highly educated women for whom, you know, years of experience really do matter in making a career. So that's the background for this. And so the research in particular that I'm presenting on comes from Brazil. So in Brazil, between 2006 and 2010, there was a really massive transition in daycare and preschool, that it shifted from being a right that was provided through social assistance. So it was, the government would kind of provide it before, but through a bunch of piecemeal projects. And it was really provided as social assistance. So childcare was a right, a constitutional right since 1996 in Brazil. So in the constitution, it actually says that children aged 0 to 6 are entitled to childcare. But the way this was provided was really through social assistance, through a bunch of little piecemeal programs. And so what happened is that between 2006 and 2010, there was this really big push to actually move daycare and preschool from this social assistance program to part of the education system. So it got moved over into a formal part of the education system of early childhood. So you have daycare and then you have preschool. And so this was done through massive increased funding and also a move from a bunch of piecemeal programs, some of them provided by the federal government, some by the state, some by the municipality, to making it all under the responsibility of the municipality. So standardizing this as part of the municipal education system for each municipality. So making it the responsibility of the each single municipality, with funding from the federal government, and then pushing municipalities to also expand the number of child care centers and also make efforts to increase enrollment in daycare in general in their municipality. So a lot of the efforts, like the funding came from the federal government, but the municipality, because it was moving under the municipal government, municipalities were left to kind of figure out how they were going to do this, especially during this transition period. Rio de Janeiro, specifically the municipality of Rio, in the end of 2007, they announced that they were going to expand this public daycare program. So they made this announcement that, you know, starting next year, we're going to have this public daycare program. It's going to be part of the school system. It's going to be very official, and you can apply for children age 0 to 4, like around when they turn 4. And then at the same time, so the municipal government was also responsible for preschool. And at the same time, as part of this massive expansion and transition, preschool and primary school not only expanded and became essentially universally available, especially in a municipality like Rio that's relatively wealthy compared to many other municipalities in the country, but in the middle of this, in 2009, preschool actually became mandatory for children 4 to 5 years old. So in the US, the cutoff seems to be 5 or 6. So in Brazil, preschool became mandatory starting at 4 and 5 year olds already, like at age 4. Constitutionally mandatory in 2009, and then a bunch of extra laws by 2013, also making this mandatory. So of course, if you're gonna make this mandatory, you also have to massively expand access to it and actually massively expand the number of spots. So by 2010, so still in the middle, like towards the end of this transition, 22% of children age 0 through 3 were in daycare in the Southeast region where Rio is, so wealthier region, one of the wealthier regions in Brazil. 22% of children 0 to 3 were in daycare, and the goal, as I said, they're trying to expand this, so the goal was to reach 50%. Of course, you're never going to reach 100% for children 0 to 3 because parents might choose to keep them home, especially on the younger side, but the goal is still to reach 50%. So municipalities were basically told to figure it out and figure out a way to provide this. And so each municipality was kind of left to do what they wanted in terms of expanding this, because now daycare and preschool were going to be under the responsibility of the municipality, even though heavily funded by the federal government. So Rio decided that they were going to do a lottery. So they announced it in the end of 2007 for the following year. They received about 24,000 applications. They expected they were going to have about 10,000 spots for this. Again, like daycare existed before that. There were actually municipal programs before that, but they were quite small. So they expected about 10,000 spots. They were going to have about 10,000 spots. So what they did was that parents could apply to any daycare they wanted, any of the new centers or expanding centers that they wanted. And then a lottery was, they used a lottery if there was excess demand for that grade. So they announced how many spots there were going to be in that daycare center for that grade, so that age cohort, so 0, 1, 2, or 3. And then if there was excess demand, there was going to be a lottery for it. And so this is really what I use for this study, is taking advantage of the lottery, the randomization, because there was in fact excess demand. And as a side note here, so this daycare in Brazil, like this public program, is provided as full-time. It is like, 8 hours a day, full-time, meals included. This is interesting because it's actually in contrast to school, which is less time. But this and that's like a bigger issue politically in Brazil, on like the pushback from parents being like, well, we had access to all this full-time care, and now school is not full-time. But anyway, 94% of children that were selected by this lottery did enroll in the program. So this shows you that like this is a desirable program that people applied to and actually wanted a spot. And once you got in, you're guaranteed a spot for the duration of the services. So, if you're 2, you still get 1 or 2 more years of daycare until you are eligible for preschool. And preschool, again, by then was universally available. So the data that I have here is that I have the application form for 2007. So 24,000 households that applied for this daycare program. I have a survey that was carried out towards the second half of 2008. Also in Brazil, the school system starts in the beginning of the year. So children actually started in January, February 2008. So the survey is halfway or towards the end of the year. during this first year of the daycare program. And then I have another survey in 2012. So once all the children essentially that had that cohort that had applied that in 2017, they had all aged out already, and they were now either in preschool, 4 to 6, or already even in primary school, 6 or older. And again, this is universally available. So what I'm interested in is that part where it was still a lottery and not everyone got it, and what's the effect of that once, you know, everyone is again on the same boat, and, you know, and eligible or age eligible for preschool or primary school, which is universally available there. As a note, so this project, this research, the randomization itself, the lottery was done, again, the municipality of Rio was left to do whatever they wanted. So they did this lottery in partnership with the Brazilian Statistical Agency. So this was legitimately a lottery where, you know, there was very little, if any, cheating in this. This was done separately by the statistical agency as with the purpose of this evaluation, essentially. Mostly the evaluation on learning and outcomes, like child development outcomes, but still, that's why like this lottery was truly a lottery. And the other side note here is that it's unique to that time because by 2012, spots had expanded so much. They had actually expanded the child care centers so much that there was less of a need for a lottery. Like the lottery was only really done at the margins. And also by 2012, they shifted from eligibility criteria that, and then lottery, and then using a lottery to randomize, as was here, to actually just shifting into priority groups. So once a child was in the priority group, they get priority, and then everyone else is, you know, like you just order everyone by priority groups. So by 2012, it had shifted to that. So there was no lottery anymore for coming in. So this is unique to that time and to how this, you know, how this was set up specifically. Do we have any questions about the setup? Okay, if not, feel free to type. So to give you a sense of what we have who applied, first, there's no statistically significant difference between the people who are selected, right? So by the lottery, you were actually chosen for this daycare program, and those who were not. But basically, we have a distribution of kids from several different ages. But the main thing I wanted to point out is that very few of those children, like only 8% of these kids, had had any daycare experience before. So these results might not be representative of like everyone searching for daycare, because again, this was daycare, some version of daycare did exist, like a more simple, smaller social assistance kind of daycare did exist. So these are for people mostly, this is representative of people who didn't have daycare and then responded, you know, applied because of this massive increase in daycare programs and daycare services. And remember that because this was part of a massive transition in Brazil, this was very much in the news and people knew that there was this huge expansion. So this is more representative of like people who find out about this and, you know, respond to this massive change in availability of daycare and this government program, not necessarily people who were using the, you know, small piecemeal programs before. So on the randomization itself, just a very brief balance on this is that, well, here we have, there's no statistically significant difference between any, on any of these criteria, but basically evenly distributed between sexes, household size not so big, 4 to 5 people, household income about 500 reais. So at the time, the exchange rate, this is monthly, at the time the exchange rate was 2 to 1. So you can just think of this as $250 a month. Percent of households that were poor, about 85% of households were poor. So poverty here was actually one of the possible eligibility criteria. So once you filled out the form, you were selecting, there were several little pieces of information that you would give. One of them was, you know, your household earnings. One of them would be if your child has any special needs. One of them would be if the person responsible for the child is working, if the person responsible for the child has been looking for work. But then also things like, does the child have any family member who's been incarcerated? that was also an eligibility criteria. If you had someone who's been incarcerated, then it gave you, it made you eligible for daycare. Similarly, if if the child or someone in their family had any special needs. At the same time, you can see 85% of households nonetheless qualified simply on income alone and on being a poor household, where poor here is defined very specifically in Brazil by 2 times the minimum wage. So in Brazil, the minimum wage is a monthly salary, essentially. And so rather than hourly like it is in the US, it's just a monthly number per household. So 85% of households in this group fell below 2 times this monthly number of 280 reais. And then another question in the survey was whether the parents or guardian, essentially the guardian, was working. So in the majority of cases, yes. And also you can see 91% of households, they live in that community. So in that neighborhood where the daycare center is. So this is a new program. And so people aren't really shopping around. This is not like you are trying to get the best daycare program out there, in part because there's very little information on which are the good daycares or not. And as you can see, you're mostly just applying within your neighborhood. And so another note I want to make is, because this comes up, is on Bolsa Familia. So the poor household, the percentage of poor household is not the same thing as eligibility for Bolsa Familia. Bolsa Familia is a Brazilian social program. And by their criteria, by the Bolsa Familia criteria, about 60% of the households in our sample, so in our applicant household, would actually be considered poor. Would be considered eligible for Bolsa Familia. And then using data from 2008, though, it seems that only 30% of our households actually do use Bolsa Familia. So even though 60% of them would be eligible, only about 30% actually participate and benefit from Bolsa Familia, like based on income. And the other note I want to make here is on the parent guardian thing. So this matters because what we asked and what the survey asked, what the application form asked, was whether the person responsible for the child was working. So the person responsible for the child, the responsável, is a pretty well understood idea in Brazil, but it's basically the way the definition was the person that is responsible for making the decisions regarding the child's education or health, and not necessarily able to, like, financially responsible for the child. So that was the definition. That's, which here I'm using as guardian, but the actual definition is the person who decides certain things about the child, not necessarily financially. This ends up being important. So a little bit more on the daycare itself and the take-up and interest in daycare. So as I said, people who applied and got selected in the program actually really did want the program, right? So here we have that of the selected people who were selected by the lottery, by the end of 2008, 93% of them were enrolled in the daycare program. Another 3% ended up enrolling in a different daycare program. The people who didn't enroll, the most common explanation was that they didn't submit the paperwork on time. But because this was a time of expansion, the government ended up severely underestimating how many spots they actually would have by, as I said, they thought they were going to have 10,000 spots. They severely underestimated this because they, at the same time, were rolling out more and more centers and rolling out more and more spots. So in the end of the day, by the end of 2008, when we did the survey, so towards the end of the first year of daycare, 41% of households had actually enrolled their kid in that center to which they had applied, because again, the centers are increasing their spots. And they're probably also shifting around between, actually very few people wanted the 0-year-old classroom. We should have more 4-year-old classrooms. So they were shifting things around too. So by the end of 2008, 41% of households that had applied and had originally been denied like that daycare spot actually did end up enrolling in daycare. And if you look at enrolling in any public daycare, then we have 53% of households ended up actually just enrolling in daycare at some point, during that period, that first year. And then we have another 6% that ended up in other daycare that will usually be private daycares, but funded by and delivered by NGOs. And so, as you can see, there's like a lot, even though people were randomized into essentially treatment and control, the control really has a lot of contamination of people who ended up actually going into daycare anyway. What we can't see is, when did they enroll in daycare? Did they get out of the waiting list immediately, already in January? They figured it out and managed to get them more spots? Or has it been more recently, closer to the survey, as the daycare started increasing and funding increased, and whether they only accessed daycare at that point in 2008 for like a month or a week? So that we don't know. Like, when did the control actually start accessing this daycare, or for each person, when was that? We don't know. We just know that by the end of 2008, half of these children that were originally denied a spot actually ended up with a spot anyway. Of the children that didn't end up in daycare, the vast majority of them stay home, are reported, like 80% stay home. And of that, the majority are reported as staying home with their mothers. And then there's a 20% that stay home with grandparents. So with that setup, how do we, to measure the effect of daycare access, I just used regular reduced form. So model, and where we can look at income, we can look at employment 2008, we can look at income and employment 2012, and then we can also look at durable goods ownership in 2008 and 2012. And then we have the selection variable, right? And that's just the randomization itself that I can take advantage of. I use some household and child characteristics, such as the household income reported in 2007, for example, the sex of the child. And then I also include fixed effects for each of the daycare centers, as they are certainly run somewhat differently. They have different principles. They might have different hours, for example, even though they're all full-time. And the errors are clustered at the center grade level, because the randomization was done not at the center level, but at center grade level together. And for local average treatment effects, I'm using attending any public daycare in 2008 as, or using selection as the instrument for attending any public daycare in 2008. So to answer question one, we can just look at household income in 2008, right? To look at what effects does access to daycare have while children are in school, right? And so we don't see any effect on whether a household is poor or not, which maybe makes sense because 85% of households were poor to begin with. But we do see a large effect on household income. So household income jumps substantially for households that were selected, households selected into the daycare program. This is within that first year. So within 8 months of attending daycare, household income jumps substantially. And next, I can look at local average treatment effects as well. So note here that for local average treatment effects, what you're really looking at is the effect on compliers. So you're really looking at the effect on households that responded to the daycare access, or like to selection, by actually enrolling, or actually enrolling. And actually responded to this. So it does not talk about households that managed to get off the wait list, right? Which was a substantial share of the households, right? We are focusing on those that responded to the selection itself. So still, we see a huge jump there. And so, but then we can also look at the effect on earnings, individual earnings. The challenge with that, and this is why I brought up the issue of the responsable, or the person responsible for the child, which I'll call here guardian, is that in 2008, the survey also only asked about the employment of the person responsible for the child, right? But the problem is that mothers were more likely to be listed as the person responsible for the child among the selected group than the not selected group. So that means that for the selected group, I am more likely to have information on whether the mother was working or not. Unfortunately, in 2008, we only asked for the employment status of this guardian. And so if I have more if for the selected group, I'm more likely to have that information to begin with. It's not clear which direction this would go, because it's not clear whether you would be more likely to list someone or think of someone as the guardian if they work, because then they're also providing financially, even though that's not part of the definition, or you would be more likely to list someone as a guardian if they don't work, because then they are not, like, they are spending more time with the child, so maybe they are more responsible for their decisions, decisions regarding their health and education. So that part, like, it's unclear on that, but basically the point is I'm more likely to have data on women's employment if they were selected or not, or if they were selected. So this data on employment is missing, but not at random.
Amy, can I ask a question that maybe you were just addressing there, which is Eduardo asks a question. I think these results mostly reflect effects on the intensive margin, so conditional on working. Is there any difference in employment rates, so uptake of employment, whether someone has a job or not?
Yes, actually, it's the opposite. So yes, there is an effect on whether someone has employment or not. This is exactly what I'm going to show you. I actually don't find effects on the intensive margin on hours worked. That said, the survey question is not that great. It just literally asks, on a typical day, how many hours did you work for pay? So it didn't actually ask how many days the person works, so that was an oversight. So that said, given that it just asked about a typical day, we actually don't find an effect in the intensive margin. So the effect really is at the extensive margin. So with the caveat, oops, said something about saving changes. Okay. So with the caveat that, sorry, this is bothering me because it's saying something about Dropbox. Okay, anyway. So with the caveat that we do not, that like there might be an issue with, data missing not at random, we still find that guardians, the person reported as the guardian, is much more likely to be employed, is 7 percentage points more likely to be employed among those that were selected. So within 8 months after selection into daycare, those households or those guardians are more likely to be employed. Now, in 85% of cases, 84% of households, the guardian is the mother. So if we just filter that out and just focus on those households where the guardian is the mother, we see the same result, that they are 7 percentage points more likely to be working if they were selected into daycare back a year before. So I am right now trying to deal with the fact that the problem is that being selected as a guardian may not be completely random, and so like this information is missing at random, so I'm doing some multiple imputation for that. I keep seeing similar results, that basically the employment status, that mothers are more likely to be working, maybe less, not 7 percentage points, more like 3 percentage points once you do multiple imputation, but they are 3 percentage points more likely to be working if they are in the selected group. Actually, I don't see it at the intensive margin. Again, this might be just the data, but this really seems to point to extensive margin instead. And just as a side note, fewer than 10% of guardians are actually in school, and there's no significant effect between selected and not selected groups in terms of school. This maybe makes, like, it can be explained by the setting where, like in Brazil, a lot of, like you can go to night school. You don't need full-time care to go to school. You could do night school for adults, for example, like get your GED or something like that. And that is quite common. Like for later schooling, it's quite common to do evening school instead. So this might make sense. But yeah, basically it's mostly the extensive margin. So here, so the summary of this first part, the first question, is that during the daycare period, we see that households' earnings do increase substantially. And there's some evidence here that this is driven by mother's employment, right? So actually a mother switching from unemployed to employed. So then the next question, question 2, was whether this difference persists once children are in preschool or in school. right? Whether once you are done with daycare and you're done with this difference in daycare access, whether there's still a difference. Once your kids are ready to switch to preschool or school where everyone is the same and everyone has access to it again. So in the medium run, basically I can look at, and here for 2012, we do have the employment status of every household member rather than just the person responsible for the child. So here, I don't find an effect, on the other hand, in mother's employment in the medium run, so once children are already in school or preschool. And I also don't find a significant effect in mother's earnings. I do include, I separate between older children and younger children. This is just, as I mentioned, by design, because of the design of how daycare and preschool works in Brazil, where daycare and preschool are full-time, and preschool is right now, but really politically there's a push against it right now. But it's full-time, and then once you switch to elementary school, then the Brazilian school day is actually split into two. So you might have a morning shift or an afternoon shift, so it's no longer full-time. So on one hand, mothers with older children may be more likely to work simply because they have older children who need less care, but they might be less likely to work because their older children also have fewer hours of schooling. But anyway, for the most part, we don't see an effect there in employment and income, mother's employment or income. When we shift to the household level, we don't really see much either. Maybe like you see a household income, some weak evidence of that, of effect on household income from having been selected 4 years before. But definitely much, much smaller than what you saw in 2008. And also, and then also when I mentioned mother's employment and income, I also look at heterogeneity by education level. But the vast majority of women in the sample have either have at most high school education. So they're evenly split between those that only have some form of elementary education, which to Brazil is up to 8th grade. So up to 8 years of education, and then those that have 8 to 12 years of education. But less than 3% of them in this sample have more than a high school education anyway. And there's no difference there. Like splitting between those that have elementary education versus high school education, there's really no difference there in earnings. So this is maybe disappointing, but also might make sense in the sense that if you're thinking, again, of jobs that you would get with an elementary school education or at most a high school education, these might not be jobs that really reward experience, right? So again, as I said, if you're a hairdresser, if you're a manicurist, like it doesn't really matter if you had 4 more years of work while your child was in daycare compared to someone who didn't, right? Like the wages are pretty flat. So that's basically how I explain this, especially from my field work and meeting people and realize like what their jobs are. Like most of them actually, like literally most of the employed people are nannies. So yes, you are not rewarded for more experience. So yeah, at the household level, maybe less clear, although I'd argue that at the very least it's much, much smaller than what you saw for 2008. And so this effect dissipates. So summary of the second result is that the effect on women's income, on household income, largely dissipates once these children are age eligible for preschool or school, right? So there really is no difference there between how women whose children had been selected for daycare and those that hadn't. So this would certainly make sense if women don't respond by working during the daycare years, right? If people don't respond by working during the daycare years, then you shouldn't expect their wages to be any different 4 years later, right? But it would also be the case if women face jobs that largely do not reward experience, right? So if you gain that experience, but it doesn't really matter for the kind of jobs that you can get, then you would also see little to no effect 4 years later, even if you had that experience. And so note here that this result, even though it might sound disappointing that there really isn't much of an effect on women's earnings in the long run, it doesn't negate the possibility that there is an effect for women with higher education levels and facing, steeper careers, right? This is really about, the effect on these women in poor households with lower education levels, right? So it doesn't negate, you know, those findings that I showed you for developed countries, for example. It just means that for poor people, this is irrelevant, right? For poor people with lower education levels facing a context where wages are pretty flat, this is irrelevant. And this also doesn't mean that the program is poorly targeted, right? The program, unless the purpose of the program was to help women increase their wages in the long run, this doesn't mean it's poorly targeted. It could have been very well a program that's designed to mostly help children, mostly help focus on child development, or help households earn income during those 4 years, regardless of its long-term effect. But the point is that it doesn't really have a long-term effects on women's earnings and income. So then the next question, question 3, follows from that, which is basically, so does that short-lived increase in income that we saw in 2008, even though that dissipates, does it have any longer lasting effect? So for that, I look at durable goods as a way to think about living conditions, basically. But we have a question here.
Yes, Eduardo asks, is there any way to estimate heterogeneous treatment effects based on economic activity or type of the job at the time of application? This could confirm whether the no effect is really due to lack of rewards to experience. He has an additional question here. Also, if there is some variation in education, it might be possible to estimate heterogeneous effects based on this to confirm the idea.
Yes, so in terms of education, I do look at that. I do look at people that have elementary school education versus people that have high school education. And there, as I said, like I don't see anything there. The effect is no effect, just the same for both groups. And they're equally split between the two. So it's not just, you know, one of the samples is too tiny or anything like that. As I said, only 3% of people have more than high school. And I think, yeah, less than 1% have no education. This is Rio, and you know, these mothers are, their average age is 30. So, so yeah, so less than 1% have no education. And then, yeah, very few have high school, more than high school. So really we're splitting the sample. I'm splitting the sample between people that have some form of elementary school and people that have at least more than that. And I don't see any effect there. In terms of actual type of job, so I can't tell you the type of job, like I can't split it that way, or I can't do what you suggest, I guess, because the application form doesn't have that. The application form is literally just one page, and it literally just also asks, is the person responsible for the child employed or looking for a job? It asks for the household income, things like that, but it doesn't even ask the education, for example, the education I'm getting from later years. So what I can tell you is that from looking at the write-ins, because we actually asked for what everyone's job is. So from looking at the write-ins, I can tell you that like so many, like 50% of these that are employed are like housemaids or nannies. So employed by another household essentially. So that I can tell you, but this is data from later, from 2012. So I can't really split the sample retroactively that much. I can do, like, I feel more comfortable doing that for education just because I can see that not many people are enrolled in school during this entire period. Like they're not changing their education status, but less so for employment. And also employment, we only have data for the people who are actually employed and not for the people who would be employed or would like to be employed, unfortunately. But yeah, education itself does not seem to matter at all for this, like a mother's education status, at least at that level. Maybe I should just be splitting it more ways, or like looking at even lower levels of education. But right now I split it only between elementary and high school. So again, this is disappointing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the program is bad, and it also doesn't necessarily mean that it has effects on it. That a daycare program would not have an effect on anyone, right? It might have an effect on women with much steeper careers. The number of
Sorry, I was muted. Emmy, if you don't mind, I'll read it because I'm not sure people can see it.
Okay, yes.
Does the number of young children in the family matter? This might influence length of time out of the labor market or the number of hours per week in the labor market.
That's a very good point. So one thing I look at is first whether this access to daycare affects fertility later on, right? Because that would make the analysis much harder too. Whether, you know, a year later, or 3 years, or 4 years later, whether you were more likely to have more children if you had access to daycare. I do not find that. So that's a good thing. Like for research purposes, that's a good thing. I do not control for number of children, which I can. I do control for whether the child, like the age of the child, like is the child, you know, 0 to 1 or 2 to, like, you know, is he on the younger cohort or the older cohort? For that reason as well, because I want to see whether, you know, like your decision how many hours you spend might be different if your child is 0 to 1 versus 2 to 3, and you might feel more comfortable with the child in daycare, you know, versus if you have other chores at home. But you're right, I could definitely include a control for that. The challenge again is that the data I have for that comes from posts. Like I don't have that from the survey itself, but yes, I can certainly include that. Like I don't have that from the application form, but I can certainly include that as well. So now that we've answered that, so the next question is about durable goods and what's the effect on, like, so given that there is this temporary effect on income while the children are in daycare, but it largely disappears when children are in preschool, is there any other effect? Like, does it matter? But then if you think about it, if a household allocates this temporary increase in earnings, like it will matter what they do with that temporary increase in earnings, right? Even if it's temporary, if they allocate it towards, I don't know, food, that might be important in itself. But here what we can measure is if they allocate it towards durable goods. So if they allocate it towards durable goods, we will likely still find this effect 4 years later, as long as, you know, the durable good is still there and didn't break. And this can have implications, right, for living conditions, for child development. Like this matters. It's not just kind of cool that they allocate it to these things, but this matters actually for child development and for living conditions, because in the end of the day, when we're measuring income because we want to know about people's welfare and how they're doing, right? So to the extent that durable goods is essentially a stock that reflects the income spent, the flow, right? That reflects how you spent your income, then this is important. And as a rule of thumb, with a temporary positive income shock, even if households have no access to credit, if they're able to save, they tend to spend about 30%, or they end up saving around 30% and spending the rest. So this will of course vary with interest rates and with people's own discount rates, but the rule of thumb really is about 30% of that bump, this temporary bump, will be saved and 70% will be spent. So to the extent that this spent part goes to durable goods, we should be able to see it 4 years later. And again, this matters not just because we can see it, but because this would reflect living conditions, and this might matter for child development as well. So when I talk about durable goods, these are the durable goods that that I have listed and that we've collected information on. So a water filter, a stove, refrigerator, a washing machine, color TV, computer, etc. This largely reflects living conditions in Rio and the poorer areas of Rio. So as you can see, a refrigerator, a stove, and a TV is extremely common. It's essentially universal at that point. But a water filter might be less common. A washing machine is less common. It is a service that's like people send out their laundry. They may send out their laundry, usually pay by weight for laundry. And then you can also see the expansion of cell phones during this period from 2008 to 2012, right? So for mobile phones, you see in 2008, 75% of households had a cell phone. And then by 2012, you're seeing 95% of households had a cell phone. So this is just expansion in Rio at the time. Also, these were boom years in Brazil. The economy in 2010, I think, yeah, in 2010, the economy grew by 7.5%. So these were great years in Brazil. And so when you look with these variables, there's like a million ways you could combine them, right? To like create some sort of aggregate. So you can think of an index, and then you can also think of using principal component score. So the way I analyze the effect of the selection into daycare on the ownership of durable goods is both ways. I consider an index and I consider the first principal component score. An index being just adding them, and you get 0 if you have it and 1 if you don't, and then just add those. And I focus on the variables for which there is variation. So I do not focus on a stove, a refrigerator, and a color TV, for example, or those 3. So when you look at 2008 results, when you look at the ownership of goods in 2008, selection seems to have no effect on this, either whether you measure it as an index, whether you measure a principal component score, it doesn't really matter. Selection has no effect on durable goods ownership, which is plausible, right? If your child was selected into daycare 8 months ago, it will take you time to get a job, earn more money, and then spend it, in durable goods, right? So computers are extremely expensive in Brazil, for example. So there's no effect there in the short run. But then by 2012, we see a really large effect, or a really meaningful effect, like no matter which way you cut it, like no matter if I use an index, if I use principal component score. The only index 1 and index 2 only means that I'm differentiating whether I'm treating having a cell phone as what matters or having any kind of phone. And similarly for the computer, whether I'm treating it as having a computer or a computer with internet. That's all. But basically, no matter which way you look at it, there's really, you see an impact from being selected into daycare 8 years before. And having that added income, or not 8 years before, 4 years before. Being selected into daycare 4 years before, having that added income, even if temporary, ends up translating into more durable goods of this kind, of that list, 4 years later, once your kids are already all in preschool or school. So this is just using principal component score instead. You basically see the same thing. And the principal component score is standardized so that there's a standard deviation of 1. So the effect that we're looking at here is 1/6 to 1/4 of a standard deviation for just having been selected into daycare 4 years before. So the next step of this is, after looking at this, one thing I was interested in is whether one explanation for this, one explanation for why selection would matter, why this temporary bump in income would actually matter for the ownership of durable goods, if that might actually come from credit access, from having access to credit or not. That basically, if you have no access to credit, then as soon as you get money, like, a bump in income, you'll spend it. Well, maybe if you do have access to credit, you would just borrow to buy those goods anyway. So that was one thing that I was interested in. So for that, I do some exploratory analysis using a switching regression. So for those of you who are not familiar, the idea of a switching regression is that there are, say, 2 regression lines. You could say, one for people who are credit constrained and one for people who are unconstrained. And you could say that for credit constrained people, selection would really make a difference, and now you go out and buy all your durable goods. And for people who have access to credit, maybe selection would make no difference or very little difference because you could have borrowed to buy the goods anyway. So the idea of a switching regression is that you are using to estimate both the slope of these 2 regressions and at the same time the probability that each observation is in one of the 2 lines, right? Because so that's how it works basically. There are 2 regimes happening simultaneously. Each observation can be either constrained or unconstrained, and you're trying to place them in one or the other, and also trying to get the better estimate of the 2 lines. That's essentially what a switching regression is. Do you have another question?
Yes. Emmy, Songqing asks, if daycare is free, does daycare itself generate savings, which can be used to buy durables later?
Yeah, no, because I guess yes and no, right? I don't know what it would be like in the long run, but basically all these people who weren't selected into daycare, they weren't like the alternative to not getting daycare, as like for the most part is staying at home with your mother, and if not, then it's staying at home with your grandmother. Very, very few children, I want to say 3% of children, were going to like a childminder instead, which then yes, you are paying for it, right? but for the vast majority of children, if they didn't get into daycare, they are home, and they are home for the most part with their mothers. So I would say, I mean, I guess transportation costs, but like really the daycare is not just that it allows the mother to work, but you could argue that actually it's even saving money on food, for example. So I would argue the opposite. But if you have any other ideas of how it would save, then certainly. But I would argue the opposite, because they're not using private school instead. Like private is really not an option for this population. So yeah. So basically that's the idea of a switching regression. As I said, there's two regression lines, and you're trying to simultaneously figure out if an observation is on this line or this line, while also simultaneously trying to figure out the coefficients of them, the parameters. The issue is that the way this would work would be that a credit constrained household would be affected in theory maybe more than an unconstrained household. But we don't actually know, like there's no survey question that says, are you constrained? Are you credit constrained? Are you not constrained, right? So here, to be able to look at this and to explore this, I've used ownership. Like I have a variable that's whether the household owns a credit card or a bank account, has a bank account or a credit card. So then in that case, I'm using that variable as a proxy for credit constraint, whether they're constrained or not. So this is an imperfect proxy. So this does an imperfect separation between credit constrained or unconstrained. So the idea is that I'm using this variable called credit, like owning a credit card or bank account, to give me a better idea of whether a household is on this slope or that slope, by acknowledging that it is not a perfect estimate for it. So the way you do this, to be able to estimate, you use maximum likelihood. So
there's a question from Eduardo. Yes. Is now an okay time?
Yeah.
All right, so the question is this switching regression based on credit access at the baseline? Because otherwise, access to credit might reflect the temporary bump in the income of those who won the lottery.
Absolutely, and that is a problem, because that is correct. It definitely, so I'm using access to credit. I only have that data for 2012. So you're right, that's like way later on. So it is definitely biased. I would argue that it's biased, in the right direction of actually decreasing the what we would find anyway. But yes, it is definitely, it's from 2012. So this is exploratory. We do not have this data from the very beginning, from the application form, for example.
And then I actually had a question myself. So it seems like having a bank account would be, really highly correlated with having a lot of income. So if there's heterogeneous effects by income, is that something that's going to be controlled for in the switching regression?
There's heterogeneous effects by income. You mean like the household income separate from the mother's income?
Or including the mother's income. Just the idea that having a credit card or a bank account is going to be really correlated with the household's income and wealth. So maybe it might not be credit necessarily, but it could be income or wealth that's driving it.
Correct. It definitely, I'm calling this credit, credit constraint, but it could definitely be that it's representing something else that's related to credit and having a bank account. That's right. That's absolutely right. Yes. So I'm just saying, I'm just using this as an imperfect proxy, but you're right that it could be an imperfect proxy for something else that's not really credit constraint. Absolutely.
And then a question from My Wish is having a bank account and credit card considered a credit constraint or the opposite?
The opposite. If you have a bank account or a credit card, you are less likely to be credit constrained, but it doesn't mean you're not, right? Like if your credit card has a limit of $100, you are still very much credit constrained. Or like that's why I'm calling it an imperfect proxy. And that's why I don't just split the sample by, people who have a credit card or not and people who don't, because that's not super meaningful, for example.
And then another question from Titus. Did you consider other forms of welfare improvement to the household other than the expenditure on durable goods? It's possible that there is an increase in transfer of gifts or wealth to extended family members.
I didn't look at that. I will at the same time say that in Brazil, that's less of a thing of providing gifts and wealth to extended family members. But no, I did not. We don't have data on transfers outside of the household. We have data on income, and that's about it. So here are the results from the switching regression. So at first, so basically regime 1 would be that you are credit unconstrained, right? Or like that you have a credit card and a bank account, and that might mean it's a representative of something. As you pointed out, Alex, it might not be exactly credit constrained, or it might also be representative you have more money, right? Or you, whatever, know how to open a bank account. But if you are more likely to be in that first regime, then we see tend to see like less of an effect or less significant effects. But then when we're in regime 2, we see a lot more significant effects and larger effects. But the point here, actually, before you get too interested in these little stars, is that it doesn't really matter. So in the end of the day, if you look at the actual estimates and then the standard errors around them, you see that they match each other. And like each of them fit into each other, right? They're not statistically significantly different from each other. Like the 0.29 and the 0.20 is actually not different from each other. So actually this collapses into one, which basically means there is actually no difference in regime, at least not determined by access to a bank account or to credit card. So this would say credit constrained is not the explanation for this. It's not that, credit constrained households are really reacting to this and unconstrained aren't. Like credit is not the story. It's not the driver of this. Or as you pointed out, maybe it's not credit, maybe it's something else related to credit card ownership or bank account, but really this is not the driver of this because it ends up collapsing back into one anyway, because these estimates, in the end of the day, they're not different from each other, right? This is 0.24, this is 0.22, and they both fit into each other with the standard errors. They both fall into each other's brackets. So in the end, for the third results, what we see is that first, there's no significant effect on the ownership of durable goods in the short run, right? So that was the 2008 results. And then we do see a significant effect on the ownership of durable goods 4 years later when these children are in preschool or school. And even though the difference in earnings itself has largely dissipated. So what this means is that households that are selected do spend some of that temporary increase in income from that daycare period on durable goods, right? And this is important because the durable goods that we're looking at are water filter, washing machine, a computer, a vehicle. These are indicators of improvements in living standards for the child and for other people in their family, right? A child who grows up with a water filter or a computer is growing up in a better environment, right? So to that extent, this does matter. And then from that exploratory analysis, you see that in the end of the day, it does not appear to actually be related to access to credit. So this same effect would not be achieved by just, a microfinance program, like something extending credit to households, for example. It could be driven simply because once you have a bump in income, that's what you want to spend it on. You spend it on a water filter, washing machine, etc. Or it could be because the daycare itself encourages households, like beneficiary households of the daycare program, to focus on spending money on things like a computer. So I can't distinguish between those two things. If that's just what you would do, or that's what you're doing in response to daycare, but it doesn't seem to be in response to access to credit. So altogether, what does this mean for policy? Basically, in this context, in a developing country context, for a daycare that targets low-income households, daycare does not really boost women's earnings or employment in the long run. As much as we would, this is talked about in policy, it doesn't, we don't see evidence of that here. But at the same time, it does offer a higher household income during the daycare period, likely by employing women or helping women be employed. So that's a good thing, and it could be an end in itself. And it also increases the ownership of durable goods, which might mean some improvement in some dimension of living standards. As I said, like it might be good for children to be growing up in a household where they have a washing machine or where they have a computer or a vehicle of any sort. And this could potentially have long-lasting benefits for children, besides any benefits from attending daycare itself, right? And the child development work that they do inside the daycare. It might also be important that they are growing up in a safer place that actually has a, like, you know, a water filter, for example. And I think that's it. I'll stop here, but I welcome any questions.
Amy, I have a question. I wonder, so you said there's no long run impact on female income. I know you don't have data on this, but I wonder if you could speculate about the potential for other forms of female empowerment or increased bargaining power in the household for women for that short-term bump in women's wages.
No, it certainly can. And actually, we don't have data on income, but I could look at, I think we have data on like happiness essentially. So I could look at that. But in terms of bargaining power, right, you'd expect that the access to childcare itself would improve women's bargaining power, at least in the short run, because it gives them better exit options, right? That if your spouse leaves you, you also have like there's one less thing to worry about, which is like, how am I going to leave my kids somewhere so I can go work now, right? Like, so this improves your exit options, and so it should improve your bargaining power in the short run. In the long run, that's less clear. In the long run, would really depend whether this actually shapes how, you know, the family is, and the interactions within family members. And this is actually like a big part of my other research on seasonal migration. I'm interested in during the lean season. This is in Bangladesh, completely different context, but during this 3-month period every year, a lot of men migrate out. So women are left to manage the household and have a lot more physical freedom during those 3 months, but then men come back. And I'm interested in whether any of that physical freedom or deciding power actually has a long-term effect. And from that context, I can tell you no. Basically, once men come back, this just reverts back. So if we want to use that for this, then we could say, well, it was empowering while it lasted. And then once we see no effect on income and on women's income anymore, then this might also dissipate, but that's more speculation. Yeah.
And Eduardo has typed out a question, but Eduardo, I have allowed you to talk, so I wonder if you'd be willing to ask that yourself.
Yeah, no, thank you for the talk. I think it's really interesting that the effects disappear when children grow up. Are there, I was just wondering, are there any changes in the probability of children progressing to preschool? And, you know, if they are none, this might imply that women have to stay home and not work anymore. So how we read your results would be very different based on that. You know, because that might imply that there is a possibility that they are gaining some experience capital. It's just that they cannot use it anymore, and the restriction is somewhere else. Or is it that experience is really not relevant in this market, and regardless of the restrictions of access to preschool, those benefits would not materialize anyway?
Yeah, I think you bring a good point. So first, like preschool and elementary school essentially is universally available. And as I said, since 2009, it's been mandatory anyway. So all children that went through daycare are going to preschool. Like 4-year-old onwards, you have to go to preschool. In Brazil, it's actually universally mandatory anyway. So that is less of an issue. But you do raise a good point that, as I mentioned, preschool, like daycare and preschool are offered full time. But once you get to elementary school, the Brazilian educational system is split into two, where you're either a morning student or an afternoon student. So it could certainly be, you're right, that women gained experience, but that this split between morning class and afternoon class makes it impossible for them to work after that. Even if they gained all this experience, very few women will respond by working once their children are in elementary school, or at least younger elementary. And maybe you'd see they wait later when, you know, they can leave their children by themselves. But no, that's a good point, that it could be that they did in fact gain this experience, and that if they were able to work full time again to the same extent, it could translate into something, but it's more the structure of the educational system that bars them from doing that. That is a very good point. Yeah.
But is it possible based on the follow-up data to know whether they were attending morning school or afternoon school?
I don't know. I don't think so, but I can check. That's a very good point. It could be different for sure. Yes, let me write that down. That's a very good point.
Looks like My Wish has a question next.
Yes. Hi. Thanks. Thanks, Maira. Good presentation. Good study. I had a couple of questions or comments. One very related to what Eduardo said. I was just wondering the effects that dissipate after few years. Is it just because of the transitioning from a full day job to maybe part-time job? Because now, the caregiver doesn't, the child is half day home, and somebody has to then take care of the child when they come back from school. And so do you control for number of hours or whether it's a part-time versus full-time job for the mother in your analysis? That's number one. And number two is a little different. So maybe I can follow up afterwards.
So I don't control for that because I don't actually know whether the woman is working part-time or full-time. But what I do control for, actually, that answers a little bit of Eduardo's question, but I don't have data on whether they're morning or afternoon class. But I do, as you see, separate between older child and younger child, because that would be the difference about whether, like if they were an older child versus, like if they were in the first 2 years versus the latter 2 years, when they applied for the program, right? If they were 0 to 1 or 1 or 2 to 3, when they applied, now if we push that to 2012, that would be the difference between bringing in preschool or an elementary school. At least, where you should be by your age, right? By your age, if you're on the lower 2 ages, you should be in preschool, which again has more hours. If you're in the higher 2 ages, you should be in elementary school, which has fewer hours. So I do look at that, but maybe I should actually just be splitting the sample since it's so, like, I actually see the difference there too, but I do control for that.
The second point, a comment, a question I had was, maybe it's related to this explanation you gave, the selection into the daycare program. Was that at the child level or at the family level? So for example, if I have a 6-month-old and a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, 3 children in my family, do I fill out 3 forms, or I fill out 1 form and say, these are the 3 kids I want to send to daycare? And if it's the later, how did the selection happen? And it's your analysis.
Yeah, so this does make the analysis a little bit, or actually the conclusion of this all a little bit harder. So basically, children apply, you filled out 1 form. No, you filled out 1 form per child. So you are applying to each of your children separately. But the survey that we have, so the follow-up survey, like in 2008, was a random selection of children who were in the lottery. So we actually don't have data on what happened to your other siblings. That's right. Like if you were a 3-year-old, I only collected data on you, the 3-year-old, and I don't have data on whether your 1-year-old is in daycare, not in daycare. Might have not been, like you, as a parent, you might have applied for the daycare for your 3-year-old, but not for your 1-year-old to begin with. So I can't even just assume. Like I know who is in the household, but I can't even assume that the child for whom I don't have the data was or was not in daycare, right? Because there are many reasons that you might apply for some children, but not other, right? Especially like you might apply for your older, but not your younger children for daycare. You might choose to keep your 0-year-old at home, even though you could apply. So I have data, I essentially have data 1 per household because we randomly chose a child to be surveyed, not a household.
So then it's also possible that even if one of my child gets selected, it doesn't remove the constraint for me if the 2 other children I have to still take care of and cannot work. And so in that way, it confounds the effect that you would want to see, or you expect that just because a child was selected and goes to daycare, the mother still has to take care of 2 others who were not selected.
That's exactly right. I mean, yes, that is absolutely right. Also, like I can control for the number of children, even the number of children under age 4, so all children who would be eligible. But we can't even say whether all the children who would be eligible, the mother even chose to apply for them, right? Like if one of the siblings got in, then you do get priority for getting your other child in. But again, you might not put your 0-year-old there even if they got in. So that information I do not have.
Yeah, and
so you're right that this actually dilutes the results to some
that's
extent.
right. That's too bad that
you might. So like you might have responded a lot more and gone into work. You know, like the effect on work would have been even greater, and the effect on earnings would have been even greater if you only had one kid.
Yeah, and it's too bad in the sense that if your data showed that that is the case, then there could have been a recommendation on the design of the program where the selection happens at the family level rather than at the child level.
Certainly, yes. But then again, as I point out, like they're also like you also might not choose to send all your kids. But yes, absolutely, yes. The lottery is done at the child level, and you're filling out one form per child. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Duncan has a question. Duncan, would you be willing to unmute yourself and share that, or would you like me to read it?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for a very, very interesting seminar, a very, very important issue. I call it an observation rather than a question because I don't know whether you have the data, but it would be very interesting to know the nutritional outcomes for children attending daycare, because over the long run, educational outcomes and nutritional outcomes in children are correlated. Mm-hmm. So presumably the children who attend daycare receive food at the daycare center. So that's kind of like a direct improvement. But also the additional income earned by the parent could also contribute to improved nutritional outcomes for the child. So it seems there's a lot of potential for improvement in nutritional outcomes from a program like this. But that was more of an observation because you didn't mention having any data about nutrition.
Yeah, no, not in this paper. That data was collected and it's being used for a different paper that's actually just looking at, child cognitive development through various tests on children. But no, not in this paper. But it was collected. I'm just not involved in that paper. Maybe you'll see it come out eventually as well.
Thank you.
Songqing, you want to go ahead?
Yes. So I have a question related to my wish a little bit, but I think you just mentioned you don't have the intensity, so it would be interesting if you have multiple kids. But another issue is also related to the method. Is I wonder how do you deal with this non-compliance issue since you have multiple year, and you show that earlier in the table especially for the control group, the non-compliance issue is very serious, right? And 1 year already 50%, but then you look in the medium term, which have you addressed that issue, or is this estimates is IV estimates, or it's just intention to cheat? I guess it's IV. You have both looked at it. Now, my question is, and how do you, because you have multiple years, do you account for the multiple years non-compliance issue, or you just look at the first year? So this is my question. And another question, I want to go back to this saving and the free daycare. Because that is also related to that. So I want to know if in the middle, many of these control group participate in other program, which is more expensive, right? And then of course, if maybe the IV taking care of that, but otherwise, then really the difference is between the cheaper daycare and more expensive daycare that may allow them to save some money to, in the long run, to purchase durables. So.
Okay, so to answer the second question first, people who don't get daycare are not buying daycare privately anyway. Like there's virtually no one is paying for daycare instead. I only have 3% of people who, if they cannot get into daycare, they are using childminders instead. So these were really local women, or yeah, households that might take like 3 or 4 kids to look after at one time. So there's not even like a formal daycare program. They might do that, but this is like 3% of all the people who didn't get in. So the vast majority of people, if you don't get into daycare, you are staying home with your mother, staying home with your grandmother, or going to work with one of your parents. So like staying at your parents' location. So for example, if your mother is a cleaner, like a house cleaner, housekeeper, you might go with her to work. And that's basically it. So no one is instead, like in the sample really, there's no alternative. Again, these are like low income households. There's no alternative where people are actually just paying for daycare. I don't see that at all. But to answer your question on non-compliance, yes. So basically, you are absolutely right. So within 8 months or 10 months after the program started, we already see 50% of the control group ended up already getting daycare. It is possible that, you know, within the next year they applied again. And so it could be that the next year, like essentially all of them ended up getting it, right? And so while the treated group, once you are selected into daycare, you are permanently selected into daycare. Like you can stay for as long as you want to stay in that spot. You don't have to reapply. So really what you'd expect is that after a couple of years, it just converges in, right? But it would only converge in for the children that are younger, right? For the older children, really the effect was that 1 year, and that they had that 1 year, and then after that, everyone already went into preschool. For the younger children, you're right. It absolutely, you'd expect it to just close in as a lot of this control group ends up applying for daycare. So absolutely, like, so really what we're measuring here is the difference in daycare participation for 1 year to some extent, which again, for the older cohorts is pretty straightforward. For younger cohorts is really just diluting the effect. So we are looking at whether having that extra year of daycare really makes a difference or not. And yes, I did present some, like I don't present that, like I have it in the paper, a lot of the IV results, but essentially it's just doubling the intent to treat results. So this paper here in the presentation, in these slides, these are all intent to treat results. Yep.
Eduardo?
Yeah, so I mean, related to Sancheng's question, because, you know, a lot of the interpretation of why the effects disappear is about lack of rewards for experience. So have you done any analysis for children who were 4-year-olds in 2008 versus children that were 0-year-olds in 2008 when you observe them 4 years later? Because the latter might have, their mothers would have gained more experience by working for more years than the other ones.
Yeah. Yes, I do that. I don't see a difference there. Again, I think similar to what I said, like this goes back to the same question, like, but the problem is that like here we're separate, we end up crashing into the same exact issue that you brought up, where whether on one hand, you end up separating them because there was more years of experience, but on the other hand, when you get on the other end, those older kids also are in a completely different educational system now where they can only go for half day versus full day, right? So it would be essentially the same approach, but the way I'm thinking about it is like they just crash into each other, where on like you can't disentangle between, is this lack of results a true lack of results, or is this a lack of results because they're older and they only got 1 year, or is this a lack of results because now the school system's different, right? Right?
Yeah, I mean,
Like I think we just end up in the same issue. Like the approach to deal with it would be the same exact thing as for your previous comment, right? I think, and then we can't disentangle them, which is fine. But that's what I'm thinking through.
yes, I think you're right, but yeah.
Okay, yes, I will certainly do that and make that more clear, because I've done that and I've definitely included controls for that. But I think I just have to like have separate tables and actually be more explicit about that. But I think we can't disentangle between them.
Imi, is there a way to, in your durables, you show that there was an increase in durables expenditures. I wonder, when you listed the durables that you had, there were very different types. So some of them were entertainment goods, presumably some of them, like the washing machine, would have been labor saving for the woman. Is there a way to look at whether this boost in spending is a function of different kinds of spending for different types of products for the group receiving the daycare?
So I did look into that a little bit and try to like disaggregate it and look at effects, you know, each of them separately. There seems to be like maybe some sort of effect that's really on the expenditure on computer and internet really seems to be one where, you know, there's some effect there. But it seems to be in the end of the day a composite of things where different households tend to buy different things. And so when we build this index, we just see, you know, a general effect, like people just tend to spend money on durable goods. So once you compile them, you see a general effect. But the only one that I see a standalone effect really is computers and internet.
Thanks.
Which maybe, like, yeah, I guess maybe that would point to, you know, not necessarily, right, spending on children or something like in response to actually having daycare. But that's the only one that I see as standalone effect.
My Wish, you have a question? My Wish, you're muted. Can you let us know if you have a question?
Oh yeah, I'm so sorry. I was just talking to myself, looks like. I came 2-3 minutes late in your presentation, so you may have already, you know, gone over this, but I just wanted to know what is the status, current status of this policy in Brazil? And, you know, you said this was done by the Brazilian Statistical Agency as an city. What has the country or the government learned from this RCT, and has it changed anything in terms of this program?
So this daycare program was going to happen anyway. Like it was more that, you know, the government has made all municipalities expand daycare and preschool as part of their education reform, and making sure that preschool and daycare were part of the educational system. That became the law. So they heavily funded this for this expansion, especially at the preschool and primary school to the extent that was needed in certain municipalities. But really preschool, this was heavily funded. So this was going to happen anyway. This is in the Constitution now. Like this, like it's even more, it used to be in the Constitution that children had the rights to this since 1996. But this is a lot more formalized now on like different levels of like, it's all on the law for education and, you know, what levels belong to each grade, what the rules are, who is responsible for what. So this was going to happen anyway. So this was definitely not done as a, you know, help us decide whether we should expand this into a daycare program or not. You know, this was definitely done like more piggybacking the fact that they were going to do this anyway. We should find out, you know, its effect on women's labor force participation and on child development, et cetera, more like that rather than, you know, to inform it. But it was done with the idea of like, they did want to know the effect of access to daycare on both child development and women's labor force participation. One thing I don't know that it was, I don't think that there has been a meaningful response beyond that. But again, as I also said, one thing that they did do as part of this expansion is that there are priority groups now, but it's not even a lottery anymore. They're really trying to just make this into a thing regardless of any effects, which, I mean, I would argue here makes sense. The government of Brazil, at least the government of Rio, when you look at the policy, the priority groups, this daycare program, the purpose of it was really much less women's labor force participation and much more for children. I mean, as I said, from the constitutional right, it's a constitutional right for children to have access to daycare. This is not a constitutional right for mothers or families. So it really was designed more as thinking about children. And in some of my fieldwork, some would even argue, given that this is like in low-income households and actually in fairly dangerous areas, some might actually argue when you look at the priority groups that they're prioritizing households where a family member has been incarcerated, households where a family member has been convicted of a drug offense, et cetera. In some of my fieldwork, some people said even that this was really a program designed to like keep children out of the house and in safer places. So to the extent that the purpose of this program is to keep children out of the house, or at the very least, to provide this benefit to children and focus on child development, I'd say that this part on women's labor force participation is informative more broadly for policy, and showing that, you know, maybe it doesn't necessarily improve women's labor force participation in the long run, but the government was going to do what it was going to do, and its focus was much more on children, and it was already expanding and already funding it anyway.
So there have been other studies, I guess, that have looked at those child level effects to show that there are benefits, social benefits to this?
This particular project in Brazil collected that data. I am not sure how they're doing with that data, to be very, very honest. But yes, there are certainly other programs out there. But in Brazil specifically, this was one where it was done very carefully in terms of like making an RCT, because again, each municipality was allowed to do whatever they wanted. So you could definitely do studies with other municipalities, but this one was done very carefully with an RCT. I can't really tell you what they're finding there. I don't know, and I haven't been involved in that part in child development.
Thanks.
Okay, sorry.
Amy, it looks like we are at 5 o'clock, so we will let you off the hook for all the questions. Thanks so much for an interesting presentation and a really interesting discussion afterwards. We've got a comment from Titus that says, thanks for an excellent presentation, and I totally agree. So we look forward to getting together and to continue discussing this work and future collaborations in the future.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And also, as I said before, thanks for having the seminar series itself. It's been great for all of us.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank
Bye,
you.
guys.